Welcome to the RUCKUS Associate SmartZone Administrator demonstration series for the SmartZone OS 5 release. In this series of demonstrations, we'll show you the functionality of SmartZone OS 5, along with the basic configuration of many aspects of the controller. SmartZone OS 5 is a network controller operating system that is available on SmartZone 100 and SmartZone 300 hardware platforms, and, as we'll be discussing here, the virtual SmartZone network controller platform. In this presentation, we'll be discussing the system configuration settings for the SmartZone network controller. Here are the objectives of this presentation. We'll start with an overview of the SmartZone web user interface. Then we'll look at the system settings, which include general settings, switch settings for configuring and managing RUCKUS ICX switches, AP settings for managing wireless access points, cluster settings for configuring controller redundancy and enhanced capabilities, maps that can be used to place APs all over the world and show their locations and provide location level alerts for any events that occur, and certificates, which provide secure connectivity to your controller for management, access point, and client connectivity. Let's get started. Once you've deployed the virtual SmartZone network controller on your preferred virtual platform and have completed setup using the SmartZone setup wizard, you're ready to log in. So let's log in. I'm logging in to a virtual SmartZone high-scale controller. There will be some instances where things are different between the high-scale controller and the essentials controller, and I'll highlight those as we go through the presentation. So once you're logged in, it's going to always take you to the dashboard page. The dashboard page is the main landing page for everything you might need to know about the controller that you're working with. It's going to show you first a map. Now for this map to load successfully for you, you're going to need to get a Google API key for Google Maps for this to be able to present you with a real map, a real-time map of the world provided by Google. This is just a placeholder map that's here for you to show you what could be available if you had the correct API key. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now, this screen, if you have the Google API map, is useful because if you have a large worldwide or even statewide or countrywide network, this could be useful for you because you can place your access points on the map and then use that map to show hotspots or locations where events are occurring, or to drill down just to a specific location and look at some data for those locations. So it's a very useful tool to have. Now, if you look down here, you can see there are a couple options for performance and connection failures. Performance, I don't have anything really active on this network right now, but performance will give you performance information for your wireless network, including latency, airtime utilization, and capacity. So if you had an active network, you'd be able to see some of the performance information for your network. And then over in connection failures, when you click on this, it's going to bring up an option that's going to show you the total connection failures over a period of time, as well as failures for specific reasons, like authentication, association, EAP, radius, DHCP, and that'll give you information about things that are going on from a failure standpoint in your network. So good, useful information here. When I collapse these, down below you have traffic analysis. This will give you information about the traffic trends on your network. And these options are sortable by transmit or receive data, whether 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz traffic. You'll get trends and client information like the number of throughput, OS types, and applications that your clients are using. And you can sort that over different APs or over periods of time. So there's a lot of flexibility with that as well. Now at the very top here, any alarms in your controller system, they will show up here. You'll see alarms listed here if there's anything going on when you first log into the controller, so it'll stand out for you the second you log in to know if there's anything you might need to address. Now over on the left, we've got our access bar for our different functionality. We'll go into each of those, and each of these has specific functionality that we're not going to get through in this presentation, but as part of the series, you can go through each of these options and configure the specific things that are under each one of these tabs. And as you highlight one of these tabs, it's going to change what's shown in the main active area of the screen here. Now I'm going to collapse this again for us and show you down here at the bottom of this section, you'll see that we have system information. This system information gives you the host name of this particular SmartZone network controller. So if it's a member of a cluster, you can find out the particular controller you're connected to by looking here. It'll also give you the version that this controller is running. Now, if I draw your attention over here to the top right of the screen, here you see the cluster information. So you see the information about the cluster that this controller is a member of. Now, if it's a standalone controller, even if it still must be a member of a cluster, it's just a cluster of one. So you'll always have information here. Then you see the system date and system time. And then you have the admin option over here. This is actually admin only because I'm logged in as the admin to this controller. If you're logged in as a different user, which you can configure, that username would show up here. And when you click on that icon, it gives you options to change that password for that particular user, preferences for that user, or to log that user off. And then if you click the question mark button over here, this will actually take you to the help pages. It'll actually take you to the configuration guide for the high-scale SmartZone virtual network controller. So let's expand this system tab over here again, because this is the one we're going to focus on for this presentation. These settings are used to set up the main configurable options that relate to the general operation of this network controller. The options that we have here are general settings, and these are to configure the general services used by the controller. Switch settings, which configure the settings related to managing RUCKUS ICX wired Ethernet switches. AP settings, used to define special settings to apply globally to access points. Cluster, that displays and allows the editing of cluster plane addresses. Maps, that allows the uploading of maps to show access point locations. We'll learn a little bit more about these in later presentations. The certificates provides an option for managing certificates that allow secure connectivity to the controller. And templates that's used to create and store zone and wireless LAN templates that you'll learn about in other presentations that are part of this demonstration series for SmartZone OS 5. So let's take a look through this General Settings tab. On the About tab, we've got information that's a summary for the system here. We've got things like the controller firmware, access point firmware, the cluster name, the controller serial number, access point licenses, and other system licenses. And that information, as licenses are applied for more and different functionality, will show up here in the summary page for the whole system. So a good one-stop place to look at the number of licenses you have, the number that are being consumed, and just a good wealth of information. So over here at System Time, what we see is the time that the system is set to right now. We've got the NTP server that's configured. Now this could be the one that was set up by default when you ran through the initial setup, or you can use a local or some other public ones. The main thing you want to do here is you would like to have your NTP server time for the controller to be the same source of time that other devices in your network use that the controller communicates with. So the next device that we might talk about is the Syslog. So in the Syslog tab here, we have the option of enabling Syslog and sending logs to remote Syslog server. Now this remote Syslog server can keep track of all the events and other things that are sent by the controller. That's enabled by toggling the button here to the on position. Now when it's on, you have to configure information for the remote server that you're going to be sending Syslog information to. Now the main thing that you have to provide here, all of the other required fields have default values for them, but the one thing you must provide your own is the primary Syslog server address. So this is an IP address for the server that you're going to be sending logging information. Now the default port for Syslog is 514, and you can send this as either UDP or TCP depending on what your server is expecting, and then you can ping that server to verify connectivity. We also have the ability to configure a secondary Syslog server address for if the primary server were to fail on you. Now the other thing to keep in mind is that these settings are for system-wide Syslog updates. These are not information going to the Syslog server particular for an access point or something like that being managed by the controller. This is the controller system level information that will be sent to the Syslog server. Now the Northbound data streaming tab, this is used to configure northbound data streaming, which is basically analytics data being sent to a third-party GPP listener like RUCKUS's SmartZone Insight or SCI. This is a large analytics engine that's built to take a lot of information, a lot of data from all of the access points, client information, data throughput information, and all that information from all the access points that work through this controller to a platform that's capable of analyzing all that data and putting out reports that help you make decisions about what you want to do in your network, where you might have to expand or change functionality within your network. So it's enabled by toggling the switch to the on position. It's off by default. When it's on, you'll have to create a northbound data streaming listener, and there's only one allowed to be configured on the system. We have one configured here, and you can set some toggle buttons here to send all data to the northbound data streaming service, or you can send data by a particular domain or zone. Now, domains and zones we haven't really talked about yet, but they're ways of breaking apart administrative functionality within a SmartZone network controller, and then zones are ways of breaking out access point groups and things like that within your own particular domain. So you can select which domains you might send data to the northbound data streaming listener and which ones you're not going to send to, so you have a lot of flexibility there. Now, the Whisper Northbound interface is used to provide portal functionality for third-party applications and connections, such as hotspot portals. So the users authenticate via the portal, which will need to communicate with the controller. So the Northbound portal interface allows these server-server communications to take place. Now, on the high-scale controller, the Whisper Northbound interface is set either for the whole system or per partner portal. So these different partner domains over here, I can select it to be enabled for only one of those particular partner domains, and they can have their own northbound portal interface that's supported for them. Now, in the SmartZone Essentials controller, because it doesn't have this domain and partner functionality, it can only be configured at the system level. Now, the Snmp agent for simple network management protocol can be enabled by toggling the switch here as well. So we support Snmp version 2 and version 3 on the SmartZone network controller. So to configure an agent for either one of these protocols, you'll need to click the Create button and provide the information that's requested in here for your Snmp server. Now, the Smtp tab for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol allows you to configure an Smtp server to send email notifications from the SmartZone controller to any recipients you want to receive those email messages. You'll just have to provide the information for the SMTP server, port, the mail from and the mail to address. Those are the only required fields. Now, the one thing I want to call your attention to is this mail from address. Now, this functionality is going to be used for both event notifications and guest pass delivery. So you might want to take care to make sure you pick an email address that's suitable for both of those functions. The FTP tab allows you to define a file transfer protocol server, a destination server, for specific functions within the SmartZone network controller. Some of those functions include sending configuration backups on a schedule to an FTP server, or to upload statistical data to an FTP server. So you do that by selecting the Create button here and creating the FTP server profile for what that server is. Now, we support FTP and SFTP, or secure FTP, and both of those are supported here. And once you configure that, you can run a test to make sure connectivity is fully there for these FTP transfers. Now, another thing to note, in this high scale controller that we're using, this can be configured on a per domain standpoint. So each domain can have its own server created that isn't usable by the neighboring domain. Now, again, we haven't really talked about partner domains yet, but they will be coming up in later presentations in the series, so you'll be able to learn more about partners there. Now, in the Essentials network controller, because we don't have partner domains, we only have the regular system domain, you'll only be able to configure one FTP server on the Essentials platform for the virtual SmartZone network controller. In the SMS tab, you can configure SMS gateways to be able to deliver guest passes in guest pass scenarios on your controller. So those are defined by enabling a Twilio SMS server, and you provide the information here. SMS messages will be sent for guest pass credentials for guests on your networks. Now, this again can be configured system-wide or on a per domain level, and each domain can either be enabled or disabled with its own specific setting for its own domain. And again, on the Essentials controller, because separate domains are not supported or partner domains are not supported, you can only configure this at the system level. Lastly, we have the Gateway Advanced tab. This is for configuring features related to General Packet Radio Service, or GPRS tunneling protocol, and is beyond the scope of this course, so we won't be covering it here. So now let's take a look at the switch settings under the System Configuration menu. And over here in the switch settings, this is a new feature in SmartZone OS 5. This is a feature that allows the SmartZone network controller to manage RUCKUS ICX Ethernet switches. So in this particular menu option, the options you have here are to register switches. So you can create policies that allow you to register switches automatically to the SmartZone controller. Now, I'll show you real quickly what this looks like. We're not going to get into it too much here because there's a separate presentation in this demonstration series that covers ICX switch registration and management. So I'll recommend you go and take a look at that information at another time when you're ready to look at ICX switch management with the SmartZone network controller. So the quick thing to note here is you can register switches by a couple of different means, by an IP address range where you put a from and a to IP address, a specific subnet and a subnet mask, or a particular ICX model number. So now let's take a look over here at the AP settings. So the AP settings menu provides options that affect all of the APs that connect to the controller. These options vary slightly between the platforms, but the configuration is pretty much the same. So the options we're going to see here are AP registration, critical AP, tunnel UDP port, and country code. And then this other option, the AP number allocation, this is specific to the high scale network controller. This option isn't available on the Essentials. So actually, let me jump over to a virtual SmartZone running the Essentials edition, and we'll take a look at how that looks over there. So in the Essentials edition, you can see up on the top left that we're running Essentials here. In this one, we have a tab called AP Registration. This AP Registration tab allows us to register APs automatically to the controller, which is a function we don't have in the high scale controller because the high scale controller is designed to be more dynamic from a perspective of hierarchy and different levels of management and management by domains where you can have admin rights for specific sets of different administrators. So we don't have the functionality to just automatically register an AP. We only do that in the Essentials edition because it's really designed as a central controller for everything in the network under one administrative domain. So back here at the high scale, let's take a look at some of these options we have. So in the AP registration tab, we have rules that are used to direct an AP to a target zone and bypass what is known as a staging zone. So if you're not familiar with what the staging zone is, we have another demonstration in this demonstration series that covers AP registration and covers this in much more detail. But let's take a quick look at what we have in the menu options here. When we create a registration rule, we can design a rule, and this is much like the rule we saw in the switch settings, where we can give it a rule description. We define which zone we want to put this AP that matches this criteria into, and those criteria can be IP address ranges, subnets, GPS coordinates, and a provision tag. So these are the options that are available under the AP registration rule. Now, critical AP tagging is another feature that identifies the access point that's exceeding a daily traffic threshold. So you can set up a threshold here that's defined as the sum of both the uplink and downlink data passing through the access point. So this is disabled by default. If you enable it, then we can modify some tagging rules and threshold values. So let's take a look. So we can set the values for any daily data traffic that exceeds a threshold, and we can set a threshold with a numeric value in gigabytes or megabytes. So we can specify any one of those. And you got to remember that this applies to all APs managed by the SmartZone network controller. So by default, this will apply to all APs in the network that are managed by this controller, and if they exceed a particular traffic level that we define here, we'll set off some alarms. The tunnel UDP port, this defines the port used by the GRE and UDP tunnels that we can create with the SmartZone network controller, as well as connections and communications to the virtual SmartZone data plane. So these are some slightly advanced topics that we're not necessarily going to cover here, but this just specifies the UDP port that we're going to use for all those communications. And by default, it's 23233, but as you can see here, we can go in here and we can change this and change the port number. And then the thing to think about here is if you're operating through a firewall, you're going to have to make sure that you set up some rules in your firewall to allow this port through so that you can permit those tunnel connections. And over here in the country code tab, this is where we get to define the country that we're operating in. And this is really critical because it ensures that only the authorized radio channels are used by the AP radios for the country in which they operate in. So this is really important because different countries have different criteria of which channels are available to be used. So just make sure that you select this properly for where this is going to be operating in. So AP number allocation sets the limit of the number of APs allowed in a domain or zone. So this tab is only available in a high-scale controller because it's the only one that has this domain functionality available to it. So if we enable it over here, we just enable it by toggling the switch. It's disabled by default, and click OK. What we'll see here is now we start seeing all of the domains. So there are a number of licenses that are available in the SmartZone network controller. I only have 5 licenses on this because it's just a demo unit for this example, but you might have, say, hundreds of AP licenses on your SmartZone network controller. Now you can select on these different domains and you can set either share mode where it gets to share all of the available AP licenses that exist in the system, or you can turn off sharing mode and set a hard limit to the number of APs that are available for that particular domain. So, of the 5, I might allocate that they can only take 3 of those licenses for this particular domain. So again, imagine if you had hundreds of licenses, you might distribute these out in a way that certain partners only have a certain number of APs that are available. Okay, so next we have the cluster tab over here. So let's go ahead and click on this one. So before we get into what we can configure here, I just want to review real quickly the different SmartZone planes. So we have a management interface, we have a control interface, we have a cluster interface, and a data interface. So let's go over those real quick. The management interface, this is the one that's used for the web UI access, CLI, Snmp, Syslog, FTP, and the other server-based functions to communicate with the management plane. The control interface is the SSH connection between the access points and the controller, and that's established over this control plane. And then we have the cluster interface, and this controls, these are the controls that act on the nodes in the cluster, so they'll perform maintenance like replication operations between different controllers over this cluster plane. The data interface, if it's set up, and this is a bit of an advanced topic, if it's set up, it'll establish tunnel connections for all the WLANs that are configured to tunnel traffic from an access point back to the controller so that the controller sees all traffic going through or from an AP. So this is a feature that there's a special interface on the hardware models, and if you're talking about the virtual, there's a virtual SmartZone data plane virtual machine that has to be deployed to use this functionality. Okay, so back to the system cluster tab over here. What we have is our cluster. Right now we just have a single node cluster, and you can see the node right here underneath the cluster. When we're looking at this screen, there's a couple things to take a look at. So first, on that left-hand pane, you get the hierarchy. And then over here in the main section of the screen, you've got your control planes and your data planes. We're not using a data plane here. Looking at the control planes though, you can click on each of your controllers here and you have some options available to you. You have the option to configure your controller and make some configuration changes. You have the option to restart your controller. And if you had multiple controllers, under the More option, you have the option to rebalance APs between the controllers that are members of this cluster. So that's one of the options, but because we're a single node cluster, we won't have that here. Now clicking on the Configure button allows you to configure some of the settings for your controller that you have selected. So remember, in initial setup, you configured a control interface, which is right here, a cluster interface, and a management interface. So these interfaces are one of the few features in SmartZone that are configured during the setup wizard or initial setup that can be changed after it's operational. So you can change the IP addresses of interfaces, which is important because you might move these to another location. And then you also have an option to configure static routes. So with static routes, and you might recall this from the initial setup or doing the setup wizard where you configured one default gateway. So if that default gateway that you've configured is the management address and you have a control interface for access points to establish SSH connections back to the controller. Now, if some of those access points are on different networks, you're going to need a static route for the control interface to be able to get out and reach those external networks. So static routes are going to be used for that. So we'll cancel out of this. And if we scroll down, while that controller's still connected, you've got some tabs down here where you get summary information about the controller. We've seen a lot of this information in the general information tab we looked at earlier. We've got our network settings that just summarize our network settings in a read-only format. The configuration, and this will also has another button that lets us go to configure the controller and make changes to it. And this is some of the same information we just looked at earlier as well. We can see traffic and health. I don't have anything on this network right now, so there's really not a lot to see here, but we can see traffic usage, memory usage. We can see any alarms if there were any, and any events that have been seen by this controller since it's been operational. So a lot of good information we can get from this particular tab. Now, a quick note on this, if we move over to a SmartZone Essentials controller, which we have over here that we looked at earlier, I can go to the same cluster settings, and it'll look very much the same. As soon as this populates, we have our cluster, we have our particular node. With the node selected, we have the same configuration options. But just the thing I want to point out is with the Essentials Edition, we also have an option to just shut down the node as well as the restart we saw earlier. But under Configure, there's a big difference here. With the Essentials controller, there's only one network interface, and it's used for management and AP tunnel traffic and for any clustering. So we have one interface to configure here instead of the three interfaces that we saw on the high scale controller. So I just wanted to show you that real quickly, and we'll move back over to our high scale controller. So back over here at the high scale, and we'll continue looking through the options we have here. Now the DP or data plane zone affinity, this is a function that allows us to configure access points to prefer a specific SmartZone data plane. So you can have multiple SmartZone data planes that are associated with this cluster, and you can have APs associate to specific data planes to maintain an affinity between them. So configuring all those different multiple virtual SmartZone data planes instances is a little more advanced for what we're talking about here. But if you did have multiple virtual data planes and you wanted to create an affinity for certain APs to always go to a specific data plane, which is very common in a scenario where you're running the high scale edition, where you might have partner networks and they want their APs to have an affinity to a specific data plane for all data to be tunneled back to them, you would be using this option here. Next, we'll take a look at the Maps option over here in the System Configuration Options. With Maps, what we can do is we can import a map and then place APs from our network on that map. So I think floor plans and placing the APs where they're actually located out on that floor plan, so that you can have visibility into where they are in the room, maybe to direct technicians to work on anything. So let's go ahead and walk through the process of doing that. So we can add different floor plans by going into the plus sign here. We'll just give it a name. I'll give it a generic name here. This will be the headquarters main floor. Let's see, we'll just take these coordinates right here for it. These coordinates are going to be used to actually place it on the map, the main map on the main display. So we can go like this, and we can browse to the image we want. I've grabbed a floor plan. This is just a generic one that I went out and grabbed on the internet. So here's our floor plan we're going to place in here. So once we do that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to scale this floor plan. So we basically have to give it some reference points of distance. So we just place a spot here, and let's say this is a 6 foot wide hallway. We'll fill that information in here and change that to 6. Drop this to feet, and we're ready to go. So we get to save and push next. And the next step is to actually place the AP we have in this building on this floor plan. So this one, let's say, is placed right over here to cover these rooms. And so now that you place that there, when you mouse over it, you'll get this pop-up here that tells you information about the access point. I don't have anything connected to this, so there's really nothing to see on it right now. But you'd see, if you had client connectivity, you'd see latency information, traffic information, the number of clients. All these things would be populated with data from that access point. So we can click OK here, and we are set. So now we have the information on the map is on board, and we can place APs all over it. So that's the map function. So let's take a look over here at certificates. So there are different things we can see over here. The first tab is the installed certs, where we can see a summary of certificates uploaded to the controller. We have service certs, which allows you to specify which certificate that you have installed here will map to which service. We have CSR, which allows you to generate certificate signing requests. And then we have the AP certificate replacements that's used to replace AP certificates, just as the name implies. And then we could create trusted CA certs, so we can import those trusted CA chains into this controller. Now, without going too heavily into the cert process and everything that goes into that, I'm just going to give you a quick look at what's in here. So if you want to install some certs, you just click the import button here. You provide the information, browse certificate files, whether they're CA certs, server certs, whichever they might be, and you can import them here. And service certs, of those certificates you installed, you can select which certificate is going to be used for which particular function. So we've got the management web. So this is for which certificate is going to be used for when you log into the management interface. For the AP portal, so the certificate for when you redirect people to a particular portal for an AP, hotspots for Whisper hotspots, and then communicator. So these are some of the things that you're going to have different certs for that you might need, so you can select whichever one here. The certificate signing request, it's used to generate certificate sign requests. You send those as files that are required when you want to order a trusted certificate from an external certificate authority or CA. So this is the place where you'd go to generate that file to make your request for a certificate from an external CA. AP certificate replacement. Because AP certificates are valid just for a limited time period, the AP certificate replacement allows you to replace that certificate that's installed in the access point. The GUI here provides you all the steps and guidance you need to do this. It's a somewhat lengthy process, so I'm going to refer you to the admin guide on the RUCKUS support site for information on how to complete this process and how to do the AP certificate replacement. And then the trusted CA certs. This is used for when your server is in communication with other servers, for example, an Active Directory authentication. And so when the controller receives a server certificate, it matches the server's CA against the list of trusted CAs it has. And then if there's no match, then of course the controller will send an error. So this is how to install trusted certs. And lastly, we have the template section. And this, I'm not going to go too deep into this because this is really related to things that are covered in other demonstrations that are part of this series, particularly zone configuration and WLAN configuration. But basically what this does is it creates a template. So if you're going to be building multiple zones that have the same basic configurations. So for one organization, you might have multiple zones that all have certain settings that are particular to your organization's guidelines and standards. You can build a template here, and as you roll out those zones, you can apply this template and save you time in configuring those multiple zones that exist within your domain. Now the WLAN templates is the same thing. It's the idea that if all of your WLANs have the same, say, company-wide policies on them, then you can build a template for that WLAN and apply that everywhere, and then you only have to change specifics for whatever WLAN you're deploying, but it's going to apply all the same principles that you might have for your standard policy. So this concludes this presentation on the SmartZone system configuration, including the introduction to the SmartZone web user interface, or UI, and the SmartZone system settings, including the general settings, switch settings, AP settings, clusters, maps, certificates, and templates. Hopefully this presentation was helpful for you, and you'll come back to view more of the presentations in the RUCKUS Associate SmartZone Administrator Demonstration Series for SmartZone OS 5. Thank you.